Welcome to Quixotic Heights, where we explore the extraordinary stories that shape our shared humanity. Today, we're joined by Dr. Randy Kluver. He's the Dean of Global and International Studies at Oklahoma State University, and his family story is one of quiet courage and compassion. In the years following the fall of Saigon, Randy's parents, Mary and Ordell Kluver, opened their hearts and their home to sponsor more than 250 Vietnamese refugees who resettled in Oklahoma. And their story, now preserved in the book Chow to Main Street, published by Randy in their memory, captures the power of community, kindness, and connection across cultures. We'll talk with Randy about his parents' legacy, the lessons their story holds for today, and how personal history can shape a lifelong commitment to global understanding. So with that, I'm your host, Amy M. Lee, and this is Quixotic Heights. Welcome, Randy. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. I always like to ask our guests, what was their Quixotic Heights dream? Do you have any dreams that you'd like to share with us?
That's a great question. I think that what's driven me for many years in my career is just the ways in which there's so many challenges the globe faces. And one of the nice things about my job at Oklahoma State is I'm able to some ways align the expertise of universities with global needs. And that's what's always really been driving me is how do we find the problems, whether it's hunger or refugees or, whatever crisis exists in the world, and there are multiple, to find ways that we can really begin to address them. And that's one of the nice things about being at a university is people have lots of understandings of what universities are or aren't or should be or should not be. But the one thing that I've always loved about the universities, it's a quest to solve problems. And maybe that qualifies as a quixotic dream.
That's a lofty dream indeed.
Yeah.
Can you start by sharing a little bit about your parents, Mary and Ordell, and who they were, what moved them to welcome the Vietnamese refugees into their lives?
Yeah, it's such an interesting story. So my parents met in the 1950s. My father had been a veteran in post-war Japan and then in Korea. My mother was originally from Illinois, but they met in Oklahoma City, married, and then they moved back to my hometown of Clinton, Oklahoma, where my grandfather, Frank Kluver, had started a radio shop in 1928. And they took over that business and worked with my grandfather and turned it into a much larger furniture and appliances store.
Mm.
And that's really where the story starts. They had, by the 1970s, they had built a fairly prosperous business and had built a new home and were pretty much living their lives there in Clinton, Oklahoma when the the Republic of Vietnam fell, of course, in 1975, and they soon found themselves very much enmeshed in trying to resettle Vietnamese refugees. It didn't start with that plan. It started with my mom saying, wouldn't it be nice if we adopted an orphan? With all that's going on in Vietnam, I'm sure there's orphans. Why don't we adopt one and bring them to Clinton, Oklahoma? And our house has got plenty of room. And myself, I was 11 at that point, and they thought this would be an easy way to do it. And then the more they looked into it, of course, then in April of that year, Saigon fell. And the need was no longer for adoption of orphans. The need now was for resettlement of refugee families. And that's how they found themselves involved in that.
Okay, you made it all buttoned up and it sounds great and everything, but I'm sure there was a lot of push and pull that went into this decision.
Yeah.
Um, would you say it started with your mom or with your dad to take on this lofty goal?
Oh, it was totally my mom. She was a remarkable woman. You hear people say, somebody's a force of nature. Well, she was. She was incredibly dedicated. She was diligent, and she would call up anybody that she needed to call up to make something happen. And So she was very focused on making this program a success. Didn't start as a program. It's really interesting. I remember vividly, my mom and I would drive from Clinton, Oklahoma to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which is about a 3.5 hour, 4 hour drive. And we decided, okay, we're gonna find a family, we're gonna bring them out, and we're gonna settle them in Clinton. And we identified that family, and they got started to get to know them a little bit. I remember taking one of the guys, one of the sons, who was about my age, and we took him to a diner there in Fort Smith, and it was his first time to ever have fried chicken, right? And he didn't speak a word of English, and of course I spoke no Vietnamese, but we had a good time anyway. But so just as we got ready to bring that family out, they said, "Oh, by the way, we found a cousin here in the camp that we didn't know was here, and so can we bring our cousin as well?" And we've already gone this far. Well, why not? We'll just add this other family to the group. Later, we found out, of course, there was no such thing. No, they were not cousins, but it was a way to sort of the program got started. And so we brought out the Chun family. We, of course, not speaking Vietnamese, called them the Tran family. But we brought them out. There were 10 kids at the time. And my parents and I were living in a fairly large house, 5 bedrooms. And I went from having one room all to myself to sharing a room that summer with 8 other kids. And so we stacked up, because my parents had a furniture store, of course, they could get furniture fairly inexpensively. So we got bunk beds and figured out how you could go higher than just 2. You could go 3. But we also learned you always have to put slats in them, because if somebody jumps on the top bunk and there's not a slat underneath it, it will fall down and smash everybody else. And so we learned that lesson. And then, it really kind of grew from there. There was a decommissioned Air Force base, Clinton Sherman Air Force Base, about 15, 20 miles from Clinton in the city of Burns Flat. And it had been decommissioned, I don't know how long, but for years, probably decades. I think it had been decommissioned since the 1950s. And so there was just a lot of empty housing. It was a large base, and there was lots and lots of empty housing. And so my mom said, why don't we use that housing for something? And why don't we bring Vietnamese in there and let them get started? And it's empty housing. They're not displacing anybody. And it's a way we could give people a new start. And it just really grew from there. And the book doesn't give all the details, but it gives quite a bit of the details of what it took to convince all the relevant authorities that this was a good idea. In addition to opening up government housing, of course, when you bring that many folks out, you got to find jobs. And there were not that many jobs in Western Oklahoma. And so a big part of the struggle was finding jobs. The people who were coming from Vietnam often with little to no English skills, often very different cultural understandings and expectations of how work happens, were being sent into these factories and these plants and so on and so forth. And how do you find jobs for this many people?
Yeah, that's a lot of red tape and a lot of just networking, I would imagine. And you said you were 11. So what did you think about all these Vietnamese coming into your town, into your home? You went from having this place to yourself to having a lot of bunkmates.
I did indeed. No, I mean, it was great. When I look back on it, I don't remember a lot of bad things about it. I'm sure there were. I'm sure there were conflicts. I'm sure I had fights with people. But I just remember it just being a lot of fun, because now there's all these kids around to play with, and when you're 11, that's what matters. So I remember we would just invent stuff to do. We lived on a hill. It wasn't a tall hill, but we would find everything with wheels, wagons, skateboards, anything we could find with wheels. And then we would stack them all together with boards. And we would all jump on this thing and ride down the hill together until it, of course, crashed and burned. And I remember doing that. I remember I learned basic kids Vietnamese. You know, I didn't learn any sophisticated Vietnamese, but I learned quite a bit. But it was a lifestyle change for me because now, you know, I'm alone with my parents in this house. At one point that summer, we had 32 people in that house, and
Wow.
we had entire families in there. And so I no longer ate with my parents, right? I was now in the kids shift. And so I got to eat with all the other kids. I didn't eat with my parents for the period of time until those families began to move out. But I think my parents were incredibly generous, and I don't think I realized that. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until really I was working through this manuscript that I began to remember some of the things, some of these stories. But it was just not a thing at all to wake up in the morning and find somebody new in your house. And, you know, there was an empty bedroom, so therefore you're in there. And so it was quite a really, it was fascinating. And the Chun family stayed with us for 2 or 3 months, I think. And then they moved out. But probably for the next several years, we always had, there were Vietnamese who remained in our house. Single men often who were working but were trying to save money to get their own house or something like that. And so there were Vietnamese around for years after that. It was a great experience. Again, I'm sure I had conflicts. I'm sure I had fights, but these became my best friends.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I can imagine. So the title, Chow to Main Street, was that a title that you picked or your parents picked? And what does that title mean to you?
it was the title that my parents picked. Let me give a little bit of background about the book. They didn't set out to write a book. It didn't occur to them to do so. But what they did do is they wrote a letter
Yeah.
to the leadership of the International Rescue Committee, which was the agency that oversaw this effort. And because the project had gotten quite a bit of attention because of its scale, at the time we were told it was the largest private resettlement effort during that period. I'm not sure that that's true, but I think it probably is. And so they wrote a letter to the head of the IRC and got great feedback on the letter. And Ordell had this lifelong friend he'd gone to high school with named Roy Metter, who was a professional author. And Roy said, you know what, you really ought to write up and make this a little bit longer. And so what they did is they took that original letter and Roy just bound it, you know, just on a normal paper, just put a book binding on it. And it was called 200 Plus. And it
Mm.
was a thin little volume. I haven't seen it in years. I have no idea what happened to it. But then they circulated that privately. And they said, you know what, we ought to really write up this story. And so that's what they decided to do. And Ordell and Mary were very different personalities. Their personalities come through in the book very, very strongly. And so they decided rather than trying to write it together, they would each write one chapter from each one's perspective, often talking about the same things, often talking about something different. And they wrote it up, and it came out of not just their experiences, but something else that Mary did that I found quite, it really changed me, is once a week she would invite one of the Vietnamese families or one of the people over to our home, and she would just interview them. And she had an old cassette recorder, and she would punch record and just say, tell me your story. And so that's where some of the stories came from is the her interviewing people and talking to them about their stories. Of course, you can imagine what that's like. Most of the Vietnamese who came had very limited English. There were a few who were very, very proficient, and they would serve as translators. And then anyway, they wrote up this manuscript. It sat there for years. I think they thought they would bind it like they had done with the earlier piece, but they really never did anything with it. And so I've been carrying it around for 45 years, and, you know, since, and with the intention that I always wanted to publish it. And this became really pressing to me because several years ago, the Oklahoma Historical Society did an event around the Vietnamese coming to Oklahoma. And I wrote to the director of the society and said, by the way, do you know what happened out in Western Oklahoma? And he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I said, I've got to get this story out. I've got to get it into the public record. And then of course, you know the rest. Toon introduced you and I, and you helped us to bring this thing to fruition. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know that they ever started to publish it, but I really wanted to let people know what had happened.
Yeah. So do you still have those recordings that your mom had interviewed these refugees?
Unfortunately, in the years, those things got lost. I have a box, a plastic bin full of all the paperwork that they created. They were making stuff up. They had to create forms so that they could just keep records of everything that was going on. And so I've got, pages and pages of the forms that people did. But unfortunately, none of the cassettes were, I have no idea what happened to them.
Yeah.
Since all this happened, I moved around the world. I lived in China, I lived in Singapore, I lived in Texas, and my brother and I kind of passed these records back and forth. And currently, I have them. But the other thing is, we just don't have many photos of the time
Yeah.
because um, the photos that existed are pretty grainy, pretty low resolution, and we didn't have, now you photograph everything. Every moment of your day is photographed, and we just don't have a lot of photos from that time.
Yeah. So any of these things that are in the box, do you think you'll have them archived somewhere or submitted to a museum of some sort? Or, what will you do with them?
That's a great idea. I haven't really thought about that. I should do that. It's really interesting. One of the forms that we've got dozens and dozens of them is the intake form. Let's call it that, which is a
Mhm.
form that my mom created that said, okay, here's the family's name, here's the head of the family, here's the spouse, here's the children. And I said, what are their skills, right? What were their previous jobs? What's the age of the children? Is there anything else we need to know about this family? And we've just got dozens of these things for every family that came through. And it's really quite remarkable. And then in the book, my father talks about when everybody decided they wanted to buy cars. And
Mm.
so he had them fill out this form, why do you need a car? Because it was an expensive undertaking. They didn't come with a lot of government aid to make this happen. And the other thing about my folks that was really interesting is they were adamant that nobody get on government aid. They just
Mm.
said it's absolutely imperative you not accept government aid other than that initial resettlement money. So every person got $500. And now that was it. That was all you got. And so they were just adamant nobody take anything beyond that. So it was imperative that everybody got jobs right away. People would come in from Fort Chaffee on Sunday night, and by Monday morning, my parents had arranged for job interviews for them. It was just they were adamant. Everybody is going to make it, and we're going to make sure they make it. We're going to give them the skills and whatever they need to make it. And so now, of course, you have people with no transportation and no cars in Western Oklahoma. Well, there's no bus system that goes around the city. So how do you get people around? So two or three of the Vietnamese became really full-time drivers. Their job was driving people to their jobs, picking them up from their jobs, taking them home, making sure everybody got where they needed to be on time, making sure people got to the doctors if they had doctor's appointments. So it was just crazy. And of course, bicycles became very important. So, but all this is in the book. But it was a logistical nightmare. I'm really astounded that it went as well as it did.
Well, there's a point of no return where you're going down this path, I'm sure, and you just got to
Yeah.
keep on going. And I can't imagine what it was like for them to even get the driver's license, and have our new friends learn how to navigate, how to learn the laws of the roads, and all that stuff. Is there a particular story that in your mind um, that was interesting or really memorable to you that you could share?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the driver's license. They figured out, there's in Oklahoma at the time, you would get the driver's license by going to the highway patrol office in a particular city, and there would be a tester there who would test you. And they quickly figured out which tester would allow the Vietnamese to take the test with a translator
Mm.
and which one wouldn't. And so they would time those testing to go with a tester who would let them take a translator because otherwise, they're just lost. And so there were just lots of things. You found lots of workarounds. How do you get people the things they need? But there was just so many things. I remember one of the stories that I treasure. The My parents became friends with the manager of the local grocery store, and he really took it upon himself to make sure that the Vietnamese were able to stretch their dollars as far as possible. And actually, there's a story in the book of how he undermined his own profit margins by showing them how they could shop more cheaply if they bought this product instead of this product. Because the Vietnamese often didn't speak English, and so they wouldn't buy something based upon the words that were on the package. They would buy what they could see.
Mhm.
And so they were buying a lot of things that were more expensive than if they adopted something else. And so, but he worked through them. He gave them seminars, how do you save money and make your dollars stretch? I was out in Clinton last week, and as you know, we did a book launch out there. And to my surprise, this guy came to the book launch that had been an employee at that grocery store.
Oh.
And he wanted to tell me his story. And he said, so Mary called us up because our store closed at 8 p.m. And she said, I'm going to bring in a bunch of Vietnamese and they're going to overwhelm the store. Will you open up for them at 9 p.m.? So they're the only ones to come in at 9 p.m. And that way, they've got kind of the free reign of the store and it's not causing a lot of confusion and you have time to really help. And so he said, yeah, so we did that. And they went from stocking 1 pound bags of rice to 50-pound bags of rice because a 1 pound bag of rice just isn't enough. And so, but it was really a joy to meet that guy who had been part of this and remembered that what that was like during that time.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's amazing what books do to connect the community. And
Mhm.
I'm curious to know now that the book is out, how has your life changed or what has opened up your eyes to the work that, Mary and Ardell did?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. As you know, this is a time of great contention in the United States over things like refugees and immigration, and it's a time where opinions are very bold and often voiced very loudly. And we're not speaking to each other. We're speaking past each other and yelling at each other. And one of the things that I love about the timing of this book is that it tells a story of immigration. It tells a story of refugees in a time that is removed from the present. And so it allows us to think a little more compassionately and a little bit more deeply about what happened and how did that happen and what disruptions did it cause and what were the issues that we faced. And it allows us, I think, to really reflect. And being in Clinton last week with people who were either part of it or remembered it, or some of them were there who had never even heard of it. But it reminded me, wow, it really was a community effort. My parents get the credit because they initiated it and led it and so on and so forth, but it was a community effort. There were hundreds of people who played a role here.
Mhm.
And one of the things that was so important, I've already mentioned the importance of jobs. Cajoling employers, please give us a chance, right? Let's bring on some people and give them an opportunity and how important that was because for many of the Vietnamese, it was not just, okay, now I can pay my bills. It was, I have dignity again.
Mm.
I have something that, really gives me a sense of purpose and I can make a difference and I can make a contribution. and I'm not freeloading. And that was huge for so many of the Vietnamese. And so, but I guess the point is Oklahomans come from all over. This is one of the points my parents make in the book. Oklahomans have come from all over. And, we like to think we've been here for hundreds of years. We haven't. We've been here maybe two or three generations, and we migrated from all over the place. And that's one of the things that made Oklahoma, Oklahoma. And so thinking about that, and then of course, in Western Oklahoma, most of the Vietnamese did not stay. They moved. They moved to California. They moved to Texas. They moved to Oklahoma City, other cities. But now look at the contribution of the Vietnamese community in Oklahoma City. It's huge. You've got an entire economic zone, and you can track that economic activity. And so that's one of the things I love about it is, when you give people a chance, you give people an opportunity to make it in a new country, they will contribute. That'll become a big part of what your state is.
Yeah, absolutely. What lessons have you learned through this experience of publishing and getting the book out there and just knowing what your parents did, and how does that translate to the classroom? How do you bring that into your academic curriculum?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, you've heard the saying, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think that the experiences I had growing up, hearing the stories of the war, hearing the stories of what had happened to people, my best friends now being from Vietnam and so on, shaped profoundly who I became. And so when the Vietnamese came, I didn't know where Vietnam was. I didn't, and like most kids from rural Oklahoma, I didn't know the difference between a Vietnamese and a Chinese and a Japanese. We didn't understand any of that. But it gave me a true sense of the humanity and what was common and what we shared and what was different and what we had to figure out moving forward. And so my life has really been about that international engagement. My wife and I have lived overseas. We lived in China and Singapore, and we've moved around quite a bit. There's no doubt that it was those experiences growing up that really shaped me, gave me a deep curiosity to learn about the rest of the world, a compassion for people who often suffer because of war or famine or things that are not their fault, and gave me a sense of that. And so several years ago when Afghanistan fell, we were able to open up empty housing at Oklahoma State University for Afghan refugees.
Mm.
And it was, as you can tell, a deep passion of mine, because it's like, okay, we've got empty housing, we've got refugees, let's bring them together. You see the echo there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what was really interesting, Amy, is one of my best friends at the time was a guy named Fat. And Fat and I were out riding bicycles one day. We were probably 12, 13 at this point, and I asked him what he remembered about leaving Vietnam. And he told me a story. His father had been a contractor in Vietnam, and he'd worked very closely with the Americans. He was wealthy, and they had a big home, they had a mansion, they had maids, they had everything they needed. His father had to sell everything they had to buy his family passage on a military transport plane to Guam.
Mm-hmm.
And Fat told me he was looking at the little porthole in this plane as they were taking off, and people were clambering onto the wings and the landing gear. They were trying to get out. The plane was full, so they were just, oh, I'll just ride on the wing. And he told me that as that plane took off, those people fell, and he remembered seeing them fall. Well, 45 years later, I'm watching CNN as Kabul falls, and what do I see? I see the exact same thing, As those planes were taking off, people are climbing on, trying to find their way out, and they fall off to their deaths. And so, I mean, when that happened, it was like, okay, we have to do this, right? We have to find a way that we can assist with this. And so we did. The university came alongside. The university offered up housing and then lots of other support. And it was really an amazing event for that. So I guess the long and rambling answer to your question is I feel like those stories I heard, those things I saw, those things I experienced when I was 11, 12, 13 years old really did shape who I am. At
Mhm.
Oklahoma State, I'm fortunate to have an academic program. It's a master's degree in global studies. And when I got the opportunity to come back to Oklahoma and revamp this program, we decided let's not make it traditional international relations, political diplomacy, or even make it area studies. We're not going to do European or Asian studies. We're going to study global issues.
Mhm.
And so what we did is we chose four themes that we would build our program around, and refugees is one of the things that's incorporated into that: global crisis management. How do you deal with global crises and so on? And so it's really nice. We'll be teaching a course this next semester on refugees and what is, looking at both the social scientific literature about refugees as well as the personal experiences, because we have a lot of people at Oklahoma State now who understand refugees very well because we did this. And so it's nice how it all ties together and gives a sort of coherence to it all.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned four themes, and refugees was one of them. What are the other
So
three?
the four themes are global crisis management, which is where refugees fits, and then we have one on public diplomacy, which is how we understand each other, how nations understand each other. How do we build national brands, as it were? How do we build the kind of ties that are beyond just the political? And then we have one on global trade. Global trade is an area where, it's one of the things that either ties us together or tears us apart, as we know, and as we look at just the importance of global trade in our economy now. And finally, we call it global leadership. How do you take stock of a situation and begin to address it? And so it's nice that we're built around these four themes as opposed to, traditional area studies or traditional diplomacy studies.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so sorry, my dog interrupted us. You probably saw such a distraction.
Well, I've got the leaf blowers outside my windows. I don't know
Oh,
if you can
really?
hear
I
them or
can't, I
not.
can't even hear it. That's amazing. Let's talk a little bit about your journey with OSU. Tell us a little bit about your backstory in terms of how you became an educator, how you got to become the dean. What's life like on campus?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of a long story. Of course, after I graduated from college, I decided to go to graduate school, and my wife and I moved out to Los Angeles. And then through some friends at our church, they said, "Hey, would you like to go to China and teach English?" And, I was 22, 23, said, that sounds like an interesting challenge. Well, this was 1987. This is the very early days of the economic reform program. And China was still a very, very poor country. And so my wife and I moved to a small city in the southeast called Nanchang. I say small city, it's 8 million people. Um, and we were in this city of about 8 million people, and there were about maybe 10 or 15 other Westerners in the city with us.
Hmm.
There were no cars. There were very crowded buses. First thing you do is you buy a bicycle and you learn your way around and you learn your way through a wet market, and you kind of figured it out. And China had not been exposed to the West at that point. They were just beginning to open the doors, and so we spent a year there. And I lost, I don't know, 20 pounds, I think. Just, the nutrition was really lacking.
Hmm.
Um, there was just not a lot of food. There was not a lot going around. So we lived in a very poor developing country. Now, of course, I've been tracking China because decided to study China professionally. And that became my my doctoral dissertation and so on and so forth. And so what China has accomplished is astounding, bringing 500 million people out of absolute poverty in one generation. Nobody's ever done that before. It's remarkable. And then, so we lived in China for a while, came back to the US for a while. I finished grad school and decided to become a university professor. Had no idea that I could do the academic thing. I mean, I did okay in my high school classes, but I was never a superstar. And even in college, I was certainly not a superstar. But then I got a PhD somehow. I stumbled into it. And we taught for a while at Oklahoma City University, and then an opportunity came to move to Singapore.
Mm.
So we moved to Singapore in 2000. And that was really interesting for me because from Singapore, I began to study the rest of Asia. I really focused on China up until that point. But then in Singapore, we realized, wow, this is a great place to learn about the rest of Asia because it's English accessible. You've got news from all over the world. You've got people from all over the world. And so I really began to expand my understanding of the rest of Asia, traveled a lot, really loved our time there. Our two oldest boys grew up there. They were going to school. My wife was teaching in an international school. And then we moved back in the mid 2000s, and I took a job at Texas A&M, where it was my job to help that university focus on Asia. So I ran an office that really was the liaison of office between Texas A&M and Asia. And I was teaching and doing research and continuing to learn new things. And then in 2017, I heard about the job at Oklahoma State University and thought, well, that's really interesting. I might look into that. And one of the things that drove me is at Texas A&M, I spent a lot of time helping kids from rural Texas understand the world.
Mm.
And it occurred to me, wait, I'm from Oklahoma. Shouldn't I be doing this for Oklahomans?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what the job became, is it was an opportunity to give back to the state from which I'd come and help that state to become more globally oriented, more globally engaged, to really benefit from it. And so that's really a unique privilege I have, is helping to link my birth state with the rest of the world. And of course, Asia but other parts of the world as well, and trying to track those global trends and how are they going to impact the world? How are they going to impact the economy? And how do we get Oklahoma ready for that?
Yeah.
And so we work not just with students and faculty at Oklahoma State, but we work across the state. We've got a Center for International Trade. And I'm in a building named after the late Wes Watkins. Wes was a longtime congressman from Oklahoma and just a phenomenal guy. And I used to tell people, Wes loves two things. He loves Jesus and he loves global trade. And he loved bringing people out of poverty. And he saw trade as a way to do that. And so he created this office that really is just focused on helping Oklahoma businesses develop markets overseas and so on and so forth. And so the other thing that drew me to Oklahoma State that most people don't know about is just the incredible international legacy of the university. In 1951, the leadership of Oklahoma State, because of the president who was on a leave of absence, Henry G. Bennett, who had become the first director of what became the Point Four program, which later became USAID. But the first U.S. Foreign Assistance Program was headed up by the president of Oklahoma A&M College at the time. Mm-hmm. So the university signed a contract with Haile Selassie's government in Ethiopia to create an agricultural university in Ethiopia. And 300 people from Stillwater, Oklahoma, moved to rural Ethiopia and set up the first agricultural university there, which today is one of the largest and most prestigious universities in Ethiopia. Actually, they created a high school to prepare kids to go into that college. That high school then became a university. So two of Ethiopia's largest universities actually came from the efforts of people from Stillwater, Oklahoma, which is kind of amazing.
That's crazy.
And so when I learned about that and just the incredible legacy the university had, it's really remarkable. And so it's a unique honor to be able to steward that legacy that Oklahoma State's had for 70 years now.
Wow. So you've traveled quite a bit. You've been to a lot of countries. Do you speak any particular language a little bit more than the other?
So I used to be really good in Spanish, and then I tried to learn Chinese. And so now, um, neither my Spanish nor my Chinese is very good. I can typically understand Spanish, but when I try to speak it, Chinese comes out.
Mm.
And my linguist friends tell me there's a term for that. I just call it getting befuddled, but there's an actual term for why, if you have, some people just don't have the capacity to do multiple languages. But I'm okay in Spanish and Chinese. I can't conduct a business dialogue in either language, but I can certainly find myself around and go shopping.
I love
Yeah, it's been
What
a
about Vietnamese?
lifelong disappointment to me is how poor my language skills are.
Have you been to Vietnam?
I have, oh, I got to tell you this story. One, when I was living in Singapore, I was invited to Vietnam. I was doing some research. I'd created this research center focused on the impact of new media technologies in Asia called the Singapore Internet Research Center. So I was invited by a group of Koreans. The Korea Foundation was putting on a seminar in Vietnam. It was the first ever seminar on what information technologies and the internet would mean for Vietnam.
Mm.
And it was primarily a bunch of Korean academics, a few Japanese, and a lot of Vietnamese. And I was, I think, the only Westerner there.
Mm.
And so this was about 2004, I think, 2005. And we had the seminar. It was really interesting. We were in Hanoi and just never been there, loved it. Walking around the old city, and it's just such a charming city. And, there's that lake in the middle of the city that had that 200-year-old tortoise in it, or turtle in it, that I think passed away about 10 years ago. But the last day, they say, okay, load up in the bus. We've got a surprise for you. And so we loaded up. And by that time, all the Vietnamese had left. So it was just me and the Koreans. And so we loaded up and they took us through the city, and we got out at this little villa and said, here's our surprise. I said, well, where are we? They take us into this conference room. Later, come to find out, I'm at the home of Vo Nguyen Diep, right?
Oh.
The leader of Vietnam at the time. And he comes in and he spends an hour with us, he and his wife, and we're in this old style communist meeting room. And what I mean is, there's a long table and there's banners and there's busts of Lenin and Stalin and Ho Chi Minh and all this. It's a very communist room, right? But he sits in there and he talks with us for an hour about his hopes for Vietnam.
Mm.
And it's primarily about economic growth and about education. And it was an amazing experience to be able to sit down with the guy who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu and eventually, caused the Americans to leave, whether we lost or not. I won't get into that. But the point is, it was amazing. And I'm sitting there saying, what an incredible opportunity to meet this guy. But this is the guy who's also responsible for the tragedy that my family members have faced, right? Because my brother has married one of the Vietnamese. My cousin has married one of the Vietnamese. They're a part of my family now. So when I came back from that, I was really hesitant to tell my sister-in-law about this.
Mhm.
And finally, several months later, I said, hey, I just want to tell you something. I want to tell you about this experience. She said, okay, well, tell me about it. So I said, well, I went to General Diep's house. And she said, really? That must have been really cool. I
Mm.
really thought that she was going to be angry, and there was going to be all this trauma. But I think one of the things that amazed me about that is there wasn't bitterness. There wasn't anger. And I remember walking through Hanoi, and I would find these little shops, and there would be these anti-American propaganda posters that were for sale.
Mm.
And there's all these terrible posters about how evil the Americans are, but the people in the shops could not have been nicer to me, right? They were just so gracious and so kind. And I realized what the war was about was they really wanted to just have their control of their country. And they got over it really quickly. They really did. And of course, now the US and Vietnam have exceptionally strong ties.
Mhm.
Um, but I forget where I was going with all that. Because you asked me an interesting question and it reminded me of that story, but it was an amazing opportunity. And so, anyway, yes, I was in Vietnam recently as well in the spring. Vietnam is, of course, as a geopolitical strategist, which I think I sort of am, Vietnam is critical for the US. That partnership is so important to us, not just for trade ties, but for politics and so many other reasons, and all the tension around the South China Sea and all that. So it's really important for Vietnam and the US to have strong ties. And so I really do enjoy going back there. I hope to make it back again next year.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, Randy. And I just can't imagine. I mean, things are so complicated, right? And there's still a lot of wounds to be healed. But at the same time, we are coming to terms and having breaking bread, right, with our brothers and sisters across the countries and the oceans, and it's just a beautiful thing. I've been to Vietnam 4 times now, and every time I come back, I'm always humbled by the whole experience. And then I find myself either speaking, dreaming, thinking in Vietnamese, and all those roots, they take
Yeah,
stronger holds. And I do hope, that our two nations can continue to foster that relationship,
yeah.
together. Yeah. So you've also you've kept friendships with these Vietnamese, the original 250 or so who were resettled in Clinton. Do you have any success stories from one of the Vietnamese families or people that you helped bring and resettle?
Yeah, I think, one of well, the first family that we met, the twin family, um, just an exceptional group of people. And after about 3 or 4 years, they moved to California, just because, there's a lot of reasons to move to California, but especially if you're Vietnamese, it's better climate, more jobs, lots of Vietnamese people, lots of Vietnamese food. So I stayed in very close touch with them. And then when I was in graduate school in Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time with the family. And I'm still in touch with them pretty regularly. Shan Hung Vong, who was kind of our key translator and one of our key, he was really the key man. My mom called him the middleman, right? He was the one who made everything happen. And he moved back to California and he was the first to open a travel agency that would help people get back to Vietnam.
Mm.
And so he specialized in Southeast Asia travel. And for his efforts, there were a lot of people who didn't think that was a good idea. So his shop was firebombed. And, so he put his family at risk by trying to rebuild the ties between the US and Vietnam. And of course, now those ties are very, very strong. He continues to stay engaged. As I was putting this book together, I spent quite a bit of time chatting with him and emailing back and forth. And he just is so focused on building strong ties between the US and Vietnam, trade ties, educational ties, and so on and so forth. He remains adamant this is going to happen. And he's brought several things our way that they haven't always panned out, but trying to figure out ways. For example, one of the things is the legacy of Agent Orange.
Mhm.
Well, wherever Agent Orange was used, it created a tremendous amount of devastation. And the foliage, getting rid of the foliage, and that caused erosion and the degradation of agricultural soils. And there are villages in the central part of Vietnam where children are still born with an abnormally high number of birth defects. And everybody's convinced that's Agent Orange. And so, I was able to try to find some ways that the university could link into that. And that was one of the projects I really was passionate about. I wasn't able to make it work. But that kind of legacy, that kind of story. But then one of the other stories, of course, which I think is so cool, the store that was started by my grandpa in 1928 and then was taken over by my father and mother. And then they sold it to my brother and my cousin. And then my cousin passed away several years ago. And so the sole owner of Kluver's Furniture and Appliances is a Vietnamese refugee, is the woman
Oh,
who married him. And she now runs that store, and so talk about full circle.
yeah.
And, it's just an amazing legacy that family legacy is now, in a sense, shepherded by a Vietnamese, right?
Wow.
And so she was part of setting up the event last week. I just, it's been, I just can't say, it's just been a profound honor in my life to have my history, my story linked up with the story of the Vietnamese who came to Oklahoma.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So what's next for you, Randy?
What do you mean?
Let's talk about what's next for you in terms of travel, or do you have a book in your heart as well that needs to get out? Or if you weren't in academia, what would you be doing? Tell me anything you want to share.
Well, I mean, let's go back to kind of what I started. What I've always been interested in is how do we link up um, the expertise, the intellectual resources, the human resources of American universities with global need. And that's why I sort of have the dream job. I was living actually in Singapore when this happened. I went to the Philippines and I was looking at all the issues that the Philippines were facing. Overpopulation, health issues, educational issues, looking at that and saying, how much can an American research university add to that? We've got bright faculty, we've got bright students, we've got unbelievable research that's addressing these issues. How do we link that up?
Yeah.
And that's what really makes me, so it really kind of is what motivates me. And what we did with the Afghans 3 years ago was an example because, wow, we've got a bunch of Afghans who don't speak English, but guess what? We have English professors. We have people who are really good at teaching ESL and they don't have jobs, but guess what? We got a lot of jobs. We got jobs in cafeterias. We've got a hospital that needs workers. And so finding ways to link what the university has with the global community is just such a fun part of my job. And so I mentioned I'll be back in Vietnam. Well, Vietnam desperately needs university places. Only about 9 to 12% of Vietnamese university professors have PhDs.
Mm.
And so there's a huge need for greater educational investment. I was in India earlier in the year. India has a need for 25 million university seats. 25 million
Wow.
seats in a university. Guess what? They have room for about 1 million. So they've got huge educational needs. And we know that education is a key to economic prosperity. And so, and development. So how can I link up what Oklahoma State has? Guess what? We got great PhD programs. So how can I create mechanisms for Vietnamese to come get their PhD here and then go back and contribute to Vietnam? You continue to have agricultural issues around the world. How do we increase agricultural productivity? How do we increase the food supply? How do we create reliable energy around the world? Well, guess what? We have American university professors who know how to do that stuff. So how do I build those linkages? And so Southeast Asia will always be really central to my heart, right? Because of the experience of Vietnam and then living in Singapore. But so in just the last year, I've been to Thailand and Vietnam and Indonesia, looking for those opportunities. How can we create that? And then the other side of it is helping Americans understand, it's not enough just for international students to come here and study. Our students have to get out. So we're very passionate about creating mechanisms for our students to get overseas and understand the world that's out there. Because then they come back sharper, smarter, more flexible, more attuned to global needs. And what we often tell them is this new study shows that you actually get a higher starting salary if you've done study abroad, right? And so the study was done by the University of Georgia and said that students who do study abroad have about a $4,000 to $5,000 salary advantage over students who don't. Well, that can translate into a lot of money over a career, right? And so, so it's not just for our students to gain an advantage, but we really want them to understand the world. And so we spend a lot of time strategizing. How do we move the needle so more OSU students have those opportunities?
I love it. Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah,
You wouldn't happen to have a copy of your book with you in
I
hand
do.
reach? A true
Yeah,
author. I love
Child
it.
to Main Street.
Would you
Yeah.
just pick a page and maybe read a little excerpt for us?
Yeah, I would love to do that. Although I got to tell you, I tried to do this last week at a book event, and I tear up too much, right? So it's hard for me to tell this to read this, but let me read the prologue. This was the original prologue written by my parents. This is not the history of a year, but rather the impression of a year, the year we brought the Vietnamese to Oklahoma. The timeline will be confusing because, well, it is. It's a set of stories, not set in chronological order. Stick with us and it will make sense at the end. We haven't tried to profile the approximately 130,000 Vietnamese who came to the United States in the greatest single migration the country ever tried to absorb in a matter of months. We know only about the 200 or so Vietnamese who came to Western Oklahoma at our invitation. That 200 we know intimately, however, and this is the story of their first year in shortgrass country. It's also the story of the American woman and her businessman husband who organized and sponsored the Vietnamese resettlement project in Western Oklahoma, and whose lives underwent tensions and tumult in the process. Conflicts rose in their marriage. Conflicts rose with other Americans in the Western Oklahoma area where the Vietnamese were brought. Such conflicts are covered. There is no way to omit them and be accurate. And then I'm going to jump to the end of this prologue, which goes back to the question you asked me earlier. Ciao is a Vietnamese word of greeting. It means hello and quite a bit more, including how are you, what's going on here, and shall we proceed then with whatever is to follow. It seems the appropriate beginning point for our account of the Vietnamese arrival on a particular American main street. So here goes then. Ciao.
Love it. Thank you so much. I love
Is
that.
that the right interpretation for ciao?
Yeah, and I love that book. And I am so blessed to have been a part of your journey and Mary Nordell's journey and all the Vietnamese who came before and after this book. It's also a book that also made me teary as well when I read certain pages and really seeing your parents' voice come through the pages and just their banter. I laughed out loud. I chuckled. It's just a beautiful book. And even though you sat on it for 40 plus years, I'm so glad it's finally out in the world. And I can't wait to see what happens with this book as it reaches more readers. Before we actually wrap up, is there anything else that you want to talk about, Randy? Any topics that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover?
No, I think that I want Oklahomans to read the book because Oklahomans should be proud of what happened here. They really should be. The community, the way the community has absorbed them, the way the Vietnamese became a part of it. I joke often that, in 75, I was 12, 11 and 12. And by the time I was a junior and senior in high school, the valedictorians of high schools across Oklahoma had Vietnamese names. It was phenomenal how much they brought to the community. But the state did a lot. The people in the state did a tremendous amount. I'm very proud of them. And so I hope one of the reasons I wanted to get this out is I want Oklahomans to understand this history. And I'm not telling the story of the Vietnamese in Tulsa or the Vietnamese in Oklahoma City, but the Vietnamese in Clinton. And hopefully everybody will be encouraged to know that that happened all over the state. But
Yeah.
I also just want to thank you. You saw it as a sacred trust to help me shepherd this story, and I really appreciate your attention to that.
Thank you. It's been an honor. And I look forward to next year when the Vietnamese Boat People nonprofit organization bring their traveling exhibition, our Journeys traveling exhibition to Oklahoma, I think in the fall of like October, November, December timeframe, which we plan to have at the Historical Society, right? The museum there,
Mhm.
and have one of the things that Toon and I have talked about is not only bringing film documentaries as part of this traveling exhibition, but also doing author talks and really spotlighting certain books. Of course, Child to Main Street is one of those books, and so we hope that you can be in town and participate in an author chat Q&A kind of thing, and do some book signing with us next fall. But
Absolutely. Look
yeah,
forward to it.
me
Yeah.
too.
And thank you for the work that you and Toon and so many others are doing with the Vietnamese Boat People Project. It's such an important project.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a wrap for us. Where can people follow you or find you on social media, website, to learn more?
Well, I do have an author page at Amazon.com. Not huge on social media just because I don't have time to keep up with it. But I am on X, and LinkedIn and so forth, but would love to connect with people. I'm telling people, if you like the book, please leave a review on Amazon. If you don't like it, don't leave a review. But no, I'm enjoying, there are a few reviews up so far, and I'm really enjoying reading them. I don't know if you saw recently, a review was posted of the book of one of the Vietnamese who was part of the Chuan family. And it
Oh,
was such a cool message from her about the book. So,
okay. Yeah, I'll definitely check. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah. Well, thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Randy. Listeners, thank you for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Randy Kluver. It's a reminder that compassion, even in small acts, can ripple across generations and continents. To learn more, pick up Chow to Main Street, a heartfelt tribute to Mary and Ardell Kluver and the Vietnamese families whose courage continues to inspire. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Quixotic Heights wherever you listen to podcasts and share it with someone who believes in the power of empathy and storytelling. Until next time, I'm Amy M. Lee. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep reaching for your own quixotic heights. Thank you, Dr. Randy Kluver.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.